And I feel sometimes
Yeah.
that competitive mindset in science actually helps a bit to drive the innovation and the next study forward. The bones are moving. Rigid is definitely the wrong term for that. It's not rigid. Something is moving.
Hi, it's Phil and Fred. Welcome to Modern Footprint, the podcast that is rethinking podiatry and shaping its future.
So, hello, Anja. It's our pleasure to be with you today. Frick and I've been reading a lot of your paper, and we're very excited to get to meet you. Well, not in life, not in real, but at least on Zoom from Munich.
Yes, thank you for having
So,
me.
so can you tell us a bit about? Well, we're going to talk about your article a bit later, but can you tell us a bit about yourself, how your journey went around the world, and so it's very exciting.
Absolutely, happy to. Um, I have a PhD in biomechanics from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. But obviously, you can hear I'm not Australian. I'm born and raised in Germany. But I would say, like, one of the many things that I did well over the past few years was traveling the globe. And I was
Okay.
fortunate enough to learn and train from a lot of really lovely and very, very intelligent people from all around the world. And that includes Canada, a lot of European countries, Australia, and now I'm finally back in Germany again after, yeah, almost 10 years. So it's been a wild ride. But yeah, it was a quite international journey, as you mentioned.
Oh, wonderful. So your PhD is in biomechanics. What did you do before that PhD in biomechanics? What was your background before that?
Yeah. I started off with an undergrad in, well, either, I guess here you would say sports science. In some other countries, you
Okay.
would go with kinesiology.
Okay.
Okay.
And that was when I first had some biomechanics lectures. And as every undergrad, I dreaded the biomechanics lectures. Lots of math, lots of physics. I was like, oh, this is torture again. But at the same time, that was kind of the start of learning more about the human body and the engineering principles with that and what the human body is capable of, which I found really fascinating. So in my master's, I did more sports science, some neuroscience, but also biomechanics. And I wrote my master thesis with Dr. Ben Nick in Calgary in Canada.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was when I
Yeah.
really kind of dove into it. Yeah, because Ben Nick is a big name. A lot of people have heard it.
Yeah.
He's one of the foot biomechanists. And I stayed there for about 3.5, 4 years, and then continued my journey with a PhD, with partially in Canada and partially in Australia. So it wasn't that biomechanics heavy to begin with. And then I got sucked into it. And
Okay.
well, here I am now.
And it's really your master that made you dive in the foot biomechanic.
Yeah. Yeah, I did a lot of different courseworks because it was all like a course-based master's. But at least in Europe, you always have to finish every university degree with a thesis. So I had to write a master thesis. And what better way to do that than another country? That was at least the kind of incentive. So I looked for a possibility to go back to Canada because I've been there during my undergrad once and I loved the country. And I stumbled across a book from Ben Nick and I was like, I'm going to try my luck, reach out and see if something's going to happen. And it did. So I went there to do my master thesis. And that was already on pronation. A lot of different pronation variables, how pronation is quantified in static as well as in a dynamic scenario. So that was really the heavy load foot biomechanics, gait biomechanics start. And yeah, I got stuck on that. Luckily, I would say. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.
And did you come across through your studies a lot with podiatrists or just more biomechanician, or did you meet a little bit of everybody that were working on biomechanics?
I would say the classic contact people that I had was typically the biomechanists at universities.
Okay.
Podiatrists are, I want to say, because they're more applied in a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
never came across someone until my PhD advisor, Dr. Luke Kelly, dropped casually that he's a podiatrist by training. I was like, huh, okay. There are other people who really like feet. Interesting. But before that, I have to admit, I didn't know about that field or didn't know much about it. I always thought if people are interested in studying feet and learning about feet, they might be stuck in biomechanics, but they don't really want to do that in any other setting. So I would say the clinical side and the patient side of biomechanics, especially foot biomechanics, was something that I wasn't very aware of for a long time.
Okay.
So when you decide to do, how did you came up with the idea of studying in your article chasing the
Footprints.
the footprint?
Yeah, that was almost an accident, I want to say. Because part of the PhD is obviously you have to know the literature. And that is part of the starting point. Reading as much as you can, learning about as much as what has been done previously from all the amazing people that came before you. And you try to do something as valuable and as good as they did. And we wanted to understand more about foot morphology and foot function and how those two sections that are often mentioned together but hardly ever really studied together in an anatomical way in terms of on a bone level, how, like, what is already known about that? So starting off with all the different foot mechanisms that we think of as normal, as just they are there, they work kind of. That was my starting point. And the more I read, the more confused I have to admit I got, because I didn't understand how all those mechanisms are considered to be absolutely true when, from what I understood from all the papers, was we are not that sure that all of them are actually happening or present to that degree. And that they all support kind of a similar theory that has been developed in the early 1920s, 1930s. And I thought, to be absolutely honest, in the beginning, that I was literally chasing the golden boy, kind of, that one paper that says, this is how it is, and it's all true, and it's all this way and all that way. I was waiting for that holy grail, and it never showed up. And I thought I must have missed it. And the more I talked with my advisors, because I have one who is very physics heavy, one who is very clinical heavy, and one mechanical engineer, so I have everything, I feel like, the more we figured out that it seems to be that we don't really know much. There is a lot, but we don't really understand a lot. And that's when I felt, well, it's literally like chasing ghosts. You try to find something. And that was how the paper came about, because I got more and more almost lost in all the literature and figured if not only I feel that way, but if my advisors say they feel very similar about this, maybe it's worth it putting that into the bigger picture so that maybe other people don't get as lost as I did. And they don't have to reread everything to that degree as I did, but they might have a starting point and then go back into the rabbit holes.
It was a massive reading, I'm sure.
I'm very sorry. It was a long read.
Yeah, but it's a pretty good, it's a long read, but it was pretty amazing for us when we came across, and when Philip told me, say, look at this article, and we went through it. And like I always like to say now when we present it, we say, go through it, read it once, take a step back, think about it. That makes so much sense because, when I can go back when we were students, 30 years ago, and you go through your biomechanics and, they teach you this is what's going on, this angle, that pronation, this axis, and you try to figure out, and you even go, in the lab, cadavers, and you say, yeah, but does it really work that way? But everybody says it does, so it must. And then you start practicing for us, being more clinical, and you do different things, and those different things that are not supposed to work. So why? So that's always been funny. So when we go through your articles and you go back, you say, okay, now you start to put the pieces together, which was really nice. So great. It was a great work for us. It was a really nice revelation. It was incredible.
I'm really glad because that was one of the challenges, to make it digestible, because it's such a massive read. I was afraid people are gonna fall asleep after the second page, and they're just gonna be like, oh my God, I still have another 10 pages at least to go. To make it, I don't want to say to entertain, but to keep people interested in the topic, because there's so much that was done and that people have tried. And what I really want to emphasize is that this one paper obviously should never be used to discredit all the great scientists before us, because they did their very best and they worked really hard and there are amazing ideas in there. And some of these studies are limited because of simply the availability of technology at the time. It was very hard to do anything with X-ray when X-ray wasn't a thing yet. But we do have a lot of other opportunities now. And I think sometimes we forget that some of those older studies that have really good thoughts and a good framework, they can now be really tested again with those novel technologies and all the novel things that we can now do. We can simulate things. We can use computational models. We can test in vivo with humans, with patients at a scale that was impossible 50, 60, 70 years ago. So sometimes we have to repeat those studies, even though that's not what people want to hear, because obviously everyone wants to do something brand new. But I think that is sometimes needed to make the science really, really as solid as we can. And we can finally, I want to almost say believe in it again, that it's actually true or not.
But I think your approach was really good, and this is what's nice. You say, and I think that's right. You don't feel when you read it that you're discrediting anybody. You just you bring it to the fact that that's true. Now we're 50, 60 years later. Maybe it's time to go back and just take a look at what was said and why, and now we understand why. But can we improve it? And I think that's always a problem. A lot of time, either be it biomechanics or even in our field in podiatry, we want to believe what we learn, and we don't want to change it because we're afraid we're gonna, we're gonna shock people. But no, it's not shocking. Just making sure that can we improve what we're doing, because in the end, it's gonna be beneficial to patients, to people around, and that's what I really like. If we do that, and I think it's kind of it's one of those studies with your paper. We don't see that many like this where it said just go back and take a look and just try to how can we improve it, and improving it makes sense when you look at it that way. So that's really neat.
Could you explain, Anja, how? I mean, every article you kind of qualify it. Could you explain a bit how you did that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main challenge was, well, there were 2 points that we tried to achieve. One was this huge body of literature and of work that was done in the past century. How do we make sure we streamline the findings and condense it a little bit in terms of, is that mechanism or the theory that has been talked about, is that supported? And if so, how strongly is that supported? Are we semi-sure? Are we pretty sure? Are we kind of, we still need some more work? And then the second part is, for every paper that makes a statement in the end, we do support the mechanism, we do not support it. The question is often, how well is that paper, I don't want to say performed, but maybe conducted? How well is the study set up in a qualitative way? Because often we read scientific work and you have a gut feeling like, oh, something is missing here. I don't really think they could have done maybe a bit of a better job in reporting what they did to make it more repeatable for other people and understandable. But it's very subjective. So we try to find a way to make it a bit more objective by the scoring mechanism. And that is a scoring method that is used or was used previously for studies that are very diverse in their design, because I had cross-sectional studies, I had cadaver studies, there were biomechanics studies, there were clinical studies in there. How do you compare them? Especially the very old studies, there are a lot of things missing in the older studies that now we consider good scientific practice, but that was not the case 70 years ago. So how do you compare these things? And this quality scoring that we used, it's a reported metric in other scoring fields already. And we borrowed that technique and used that to try to be less subjective and a bit more objective when you talk about the quality of the studies. And use that to either support or maybe put a little warning sign up and say, look, 5 studies say the mechanism definitely works, but a lot of information is missing in these studies. They have a very low quality score. Maybe we should be a little bit careful with their conclusions. So that we have those 2 parts to rely on: the results of the studies and the quality of the studies. Obviously, someone else might score it a little bit differently. That's why we made our scoring rubric public, so that you could go back and look at the paper and see how did they score it. And if you read it again, you might say, well, I would give them 2 points more, because I think actually this is very clear. And I think that's good. That's the kind of discussion we do need, and that's why we need to be very open about our science and also share those informations, how we get to a certain scoring metric. But those were the 2 parts that were kind of driving the methodology of the paper, that we hopefully in the end can say that mechanisms get 5 yeses, 5 no's, and really good quality scores in all of them. So it seems like we do need more research instead of just better one, because we're still kind of even, or there are 3 papers that say, yes, the mechanism exists, but all of them were poor in quality. The next study we should do is maybe improving X, Y, Z to make them more scientifically sound or more objective in that sense.
And I love that after you described a couple of articles, older one, you brought back a new article or newer article that say, well, this one is made with more technology, and we finally were able to more understand what is happening in the foot instead of only assumption. That's how it's working. Now we have data that say, well, maybe it's not working the way it is.
Yeah, and I think...
Could you...
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. You go first.
But can you explain a bit more what was the purpose of the study? I mean, you talk a lot about the rigid lever, flexible adapter that all podiatrists or all people that work with feet were taught at school.
I think what the common theme was for most of the biomechanics papers that talk about specific foot function mechanisms, that they always came back to this mobile adapter rigid lever theory. And they seemed to tie all of that together. So I went down this rabbit hole and tried to figure out, so where does this come from, this theory? And that was a wild goose chase. I'm still not sure if I found the goose or the egg or I found something. If that was the very first one, if someone really knows which one was the very first one, please send it to me, because I'm not 100% certain I really, really found it. We went back to one of the earliest papers that I was able to dig out, where they talked about this theory that the foot is very mobile when we land, when we have a touchdown, and then it keeps deforming and adjusting to the surrounding, to the ground, to the floor, until about mid-stance. And in order to push off again, it should magically turn into this rigid lever to push off. And a lot of the early scientists said, yeah, of course it has to be rigid, because that's the only way how we can push off. Because if it was soft, we wouldn't be able to create this forward propulsion. That's how it works.
That's what we learn in school.
Exactly. That is that is the textbook kind of explanation. But for whatever reason, it was never really shown that that's actually how it works. And all the mechanisms try to find a way how to explain how this theory should work by using the mechanism. Right. And then they prove or disprove the mechanism, but not really the underlying theory, which was really interesting. And I was like, now we do have biplanar video radiography. We have weight-bearing CT. We can literally see what the bones are doing, if they are moving or if they're not moving, at any time point through our stance phase, for example. So if something is rigid, it should not move. Yet all those studies now that look at the foot with biplanar video radiography, single plane video radiography, even bone pins when video radiography was not maybe as accessible, all of these studies showed the bones are moving throughout the entire stance phase. They might be moving a little bit less, a little bit more, but they're moving. So rigid is definitely the wrong term for that. It's not rigid. Something is moving. That should be the first sign that something is not quite right with that theory. Yeah. And yet, still, people refer to it as it's rigid, or it turns into this stiff kind of mechanism. It might be stiffer than like in the early stages, but not stiff, because then again, it would be rigid and wouldn't move. So one part is the terminology that might be misleading. And one part might be that it's just very comfortable to hold on to those things that we've learned from an early age on. And that makes sense and simplifies it. The foot is not simple. There are too many bones in
And
there.
I think you're right. I think you're right. It makes, I think I like your second option is make people more comfortable to do that
Yeah.
because, developing the biomechanics how to treat it. Even the surgeon, if I look at a foot surgeon, they're going to use all those, mechanism to say, all right, let's do that type of surgery because we're going to bring the foot in that rigid position. But when you think about it, it doesn't make sense when you go back. So maybe we should change that. That's maybe the reason why some of those surgeries don't work, or some of those orthotics or whatever. But how was the reaction of people when it came out? Like I said, for us it was, like I said, revelation. We love it. We say it just make us work. But how was the people reacting, looking at it? And there's people from all kind of different opinions. So how was it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was terrified to hear their reaction or to read them, to be honest, especially if you're, an emerging scientist on the trainee side, and then you have people who have like experience for the last 30, 40 years in that field. And of course, that is, yeah, it's slightly terrifying, not being quite sure what kind of reaction this is going to cause. And you might step on people's toes. That's not very comfortable sometimes, maybe necessary. I would say, almost every reaction I was hoping for and dreading at the same time. I had people saying, finally, someone else who also says it. I was thinking about that for so many years, and now there's a paper, and it's, in their opinion, well written and well conducted and well summarized. And I had people saying, why did you write it? I already knew all of this. And I had people who said, but that's not how it is. It was every single reaction. And I think that's the beauty of science, because in the end, the paper was written by us because we thought it's a good way to present data and to summarize it. And it's your job as the reader to take that and use that, incorporate that into your perspective of what you know, how you maybe also value the science, and use it as a guidance. You shouldn't use that as the holy grail and say, like, but she said at that time it's not true, or it is true. But ideally, we would ask each other, like, okay, so what would I need to do as a next study to convince you that this is not true or that this is true? And ideally, that would push both of us to be better scientists and to come up with better ideas to prove each other that our point is correct. And I feel sometimes that competitive mindset in science actually helps a bit to drive the innovation and the next study forward. So I think having those reactions where they really go like, nah, I don't really believe you. I'm like, then go and do something. Show me that it exists.
Yeah,
And there we go.
it's good. It's good to be challenging. I think that's what the nice thing about that. If if you read it and you take it on both sides, like you say, you believe it, you don't believe it, but at least it challenges you to start thinking. Because I can say that, the next Monday morning I was back in clinic and I was thinking about what I read, and I look at my patient. You start thinking, do I still say the same thing to my patient? What's going on? Maybe no. Or you start, so that's good. And like you said, if you don't believe it, prove why it's not what we think it is. Otherwise, the other way, what can we do to even bring more data to know about it and to improve it?
Exactly. And I love it that you say you even go back into and bring that back into your kind of work day and your daily routine that you have with your patients. I think that was the best reaction I got, because from the academic perspective, I feel like I spend so much time in the lab, reading through literature, working on teeny tiny details. But I'm not the one who has to bring or to communicate that with the patient. I'm not the surgeon. I'm not the one who's working with the athletes to make the next big shoe for the athlete to make them run faster or something. Like, there are other people who take it that step further, and to see that this was incorporated and well received as well as critically received, at least there was a reaction. And that was more than I think a lot of scientists can actually hope for sometimes, because as you sit in your little teeny tiny lab and you hope someone is going to read your paper, that's the biggest hope. And someone did, and that is amazing.
Well, I can assure you a lot of people read it. Like I told you, we did a presentation in the Ontario Chiropody Society in April, and there was a lot of good reaction. A couple of people that were not happy that their belief were maybe wrong, but a lot of open people. And we did that in many podiatrists in Quebec too. And there was a lot of talking and a lot of questioning. Well, how can we do better with our patient next? And that's always the thing. I mean, even on research, a lot of research are just they base their assumption of the mobile adapter rigid lever is true. All right, we'll do the research with that in mind. But now they need to do, well, that's maybe not true. How can we design a research differently and learn more to take care of the patient, take care of the athlete, to take care of everybody?
And I think
And
that is one part of the challenge, right? It's one question is the basic science question. Like, I feel like a lot of us, especially coming from the mechanical aspect or the purely academic aspect, it's just interesting to know how things work. But from the more applicable side, as a clinician, as a podiatrist, as a surgeon, you need to know how, even if you use it, how can you make someone's life better? And does that count? It's nice to know whether the theory is true or not, but if it doesn't really help the patient, what can you do to improve the outcome, to improve the performance, and to restore function? And I think that is one thing where I feel more people need to take it a step further. Right now, we're in the basic science level, and we need to put it out there that actually people who work with other people use it.
Maybe you can go back a bit into your article, and can you tell us, like, I think it was maybe 7 statements that you challenge, or that, well, you that were the assumption of the mobile adapter rigid lever that you went through each of them. Can you go?
Each of the
I know
mechanisms,
it's
you mean?
yeah.
Yeah, there are quite a few. To be honest, I think they're even more than that. Whether they're as popular, I feel like sometimes people come up with their own mechanisms
yeah,
and like
absolutely.
kind of mixed forms. But yeah, I think mainly we identified 7 that use them very, very heavily. That starts from the arches. They're the transverse, the longitudinal arches, lateral as well as medial sides. They often are linked to foot posture, dynamically as well as statically. And who hasn't heard of the like flat foot and the high arched foot? Those are just classic examples when we talk about arches. And arches are typically believed to provide structure to the foot, and that is definitely true. However, we are back to the terminology. Maybe their structure and support doesn't necessarily mean that they're inflexible, rigid, and stiff, but we can modulate that. And that was shown with simulations as well as now again with some of the biplanar studies, that the arch gets modulated and adjusts throughout the entire stance phase. We also have the classic mid-tarsal break, as well as the calcaneocuboid locking. There are a few mechanisms that use a lot of like locking terminology and breaking, almost the opposite of the locking part. And both means that either it can open up, but that breaking almost means a rigid structure breaks open. It doesn't sound healthy. It doesn't sound good. And that's almost like what the idea was, that it's a bad thing if it opens up, because again, it goes against the rigidity of the foot that the foot apparently needs, which is not quite true. And similar to the locking is the idea that 2 bones or multiple bones locked together, kind of in a almost twisting movement. When you can think about, you have a screw that you screw into one another and make it more fixed and more rigid. Yes, the idea is, again, you provide more structure to it and therefore more stability. And it doesn't seem to work that exact way. No one has ever shown that bones are actually locking. And if you think about it a little bit more, do you want 2 bones to collide almost into each other and like grind on each other? Most of us would go like, probably not. Doesn't sound too good either. But that is in very lay terms. But I think sometimes it helps to understand, do we really want bones to lock rigidly? And how can that look like? And that also was shown with single plane video rheography studies and dual plane studies, that there's constant movement. The axes are in motion. There's not one axis that determines all the other motions of the bones. There are some that might be more of interest, I want to say. And it seemed to be like a parent bone that guides others. The talus seems to be one of the bones, and the midfoot bones seem to be arranged around the talus and move along, but it's not rigid. It's never locked. It's always flexible.
I think you're right. The terminology is so important because
Very
when you say,
important.
the metatarsal breaking, it
Yeah.
sounds like you just mentioned, it sounds bad. So now you say it must be bad. Or, the locking, unlocking, it should be unlocking. Why? I'm not opening a door. It's just,
Yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah.
make sense when you think about it. So, and then, I think you're right. The terminology is so important.
And it creates an image right away in your head,
Yeah.
right? How it should work. So someone just says it's a locking mechanism, and you think about this like key and lock principle, and then it's rigid, it's solid, you can't move it, it's immobile. And the terminology drives the way we're thinking about these mechanisms and also how we interpret them. And then how we communicate them again, and then more and more gets lost along the way. And then it might be very nuanced in the beginning, and then it's very simple. It locks, it doesn't move in the very end. So I think those are part of these things. And one of the mechanisms I think that I could have written at least another 5 papers on are the windlass mechanism and the classic like arch or foot spring kind of idea. Those are the ones that gained lots and lots of attention in the last decades because it's one of those mechanisms that includes also soft tissues, the ligament, the plantar fascia, and that gained a lot of attention as well over the last years because of injuries or because of a lot of complaints from patients maybe as well. It gained more popularity, I almost want to say. It's wider known. And then from the sporting background, since we have those lovely, amazing running shoes now, and they think about the stiff plate in this shoe. Everyone knows the carbon fiber plate shoes now, and everyone runs in them. Even if it's a 7-hour marathon time, they still take the carbon fiber foot plate shoe. And well, that comes from also the idea of a windlass mechanism. You try to shift the moment arm because the center of rotation shifts in the foot. And then your muscles can, I almost want to say, work more economically in that way. Yeah. So it makes it almost, I don't want to say easier to run because it takes a toll on your muscles. But from a mechanistic perspective, it should be an advantage. And the windlass mechanism does something very similar. It's one point where you almost stretch the plantar fascia and the arch kind of goes up, gets a bit more of a peak. And when you go back down and you load the arch, it opens up. So it's more like a windlass that you wrap around the metatarsal head, like a ligament. Can you think about it like a string? When you pull on it, it collapses the arch and then it goes back out.
But
that's
not
always the
necessarily,
idea.
but not necessarily make it more rigid.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, it does make it very rigid. But yeah, it's moving again. Otherwise, how do you get this movement of the arch when it's rigid? It's super, super interesting. And then one of my advisors, she did her PhD on the windlass mechanism. So she was a great help with all of that. And we got lost in so many discussions. Well, I don't want to say lost because it was pure pleasure. But there's so much in there. And one part I think that came very evident when we talked about the windlass mechanism, I hope it came across in the manuscript too. The windlass mechanism and the arch spring, when you think about the arch kind of collapses and goes back up, it's almost like a little spring when you load it. They work in tandem. So none of those mechanisms is there in solitude. If they do exist, they all work at the same time and they influence each other. And in some feet, they might be more of a windlass mechanism, less of a longitudinal arch stability mechanism. One person might have a bit more of a, for lack of better terminology, I'm going to say midfoot break right now. Yeah. And some other people might have more of a pronated foot posture. But it all happens at the same time, which is a nightmare for every scientist. And I can imagine for every clinician, because where do you start, where do you end?
Well, one thing that Frederick and I always did is allow the foot to move so we can have those mechanisms that the human developed to be more efficient. Because if you lock that mechanism, that you make your foot very rigid, well, you're not getting any advantage for you from your spring, arch spring mechanism, or even windlass. So
Yeah.
very
Yeah. And I feel like
Right.
maybe the idea with blocking certain movements, I'm certain that there are instances and indications and patients that really benefit from that, either for a certain amount of time or for certain treatments. In my opinion, not being a clinician, I think if that is the generic treatment for everything, as you said, we limit the ability of the foot to adjust to all the other things that also happen. We might think we just change one aspect, but we actually change at least 5 at the same time that we weren't even aware of at that moment. And that might
And
cause other problems down the road. It might not short term, but if we keep doing that for many, many years or for a long time, that might have other problems surfacing after a while.
Well,
It's always a
just bring
challenge.
back the idea of the foot. Like you said, we like to say we're guiding the foot instead of blocking it. I think you're right, and we have to think that we're not just touching on one aspect of the foot. We're touching on the muscles, the fascia, the what's going on. Even now, it's connected to the leg, and you go up, and you cannot just look at the foot itself. It's all the impact. It goes all the way up, and I think you're right.
Absolutely.
We don't realize we're trying to, and that's what we do every day. We're trying to realize that what we're doing, but that's why I think it's so important to start to understand even better. So all the professional kind of working, like I said, us being more clinician with patient, and when we work for other professional, how can we all work together? Because we kind sometimes we want to do all the same thing, but we do it differently because we don't understand what you're doing and what they're doing. And some say, don't, block it, don't block it. But when you start looking at it that way, that the movement and the guidance is different. So you're right. We have to start thinking about more that there's not just one thing we're affecting when we're touching the foot. It's many things.
Absolutely. I think one of the terms that Benno always said is like the foot is the foundation of the skyscraper, but if you
Yeah.
change the foundation, you change the very top as well. So it's one of the things that sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I remember someone once told me that. And it's really good to keep those things in mind. Because yeah, it's the human body, and we always isolate things, and we try to break it down into pieces that we can grasp and that our minds can understand. And I think that's very important, very necessary. But we also have to put the puzzle piece back into the bigger picture. And sometimes we forget about that, and I'm guilty of that as well. I love my little puzzle pieces, and I enjoy playing with just 2 of them, and all of a sudden I have 10, I'm all confused again.
Yeah.
So
But I think
that's
we're
how it goes.
and we all do this. Yeah, we all do the same, and we go back what you were saying earlier. It's good to have paper research that challenge you and just say, all right, yeah, there's more to my little puzzle. There's another piece of that puzzle somewhere else that I didn't know I was looking for, and maybe by using it. So that's good. So where do you think we're going from there? What do you see next in research that after what would you say you're all for, or you think that could be done, that you would like to say, what kind of research should be done?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do.
Yeah.
If I can dream big, I would love
Yeah.
to see that people use the different papers and connect the dots, kind of, instead of
Yeah.
going down the rabbit hole just with one approach. Take one step back, use the different options that are there. That means novel technology, that means what other people have done, and then try to find the link between them instead of working on your teeny tiny piece. That means I spent the last 3 years after looking through the literature in looking into more morphology and function, how these two are linked, because that was one of the other things that really struck me as astonishing, that most of the foot mechanisms somehow state that certain foot types might be more prominent for this mechanism, or it might be more present, or it might be beneficial for some foot types or foot morphologies. And to me, that was another thing. I was like, what does that really mean? Do we talk about external foot shape, internal foot shape? Do we talk about soft tissues as well? How tight they are, maybe how much play we have when we talk about ligaments. If someone who has multiple ankle sprains, are they equally likely to have a certain foot posture than someone who never sprained their ankle even once in their entire life? What about the internal morphology, bones? When I specifically talk about bones, for example, because they are of great interest for anthropology, for example. They find foot bones, maybe ideally an entire fossil foot, and then they try to recreate how has that person or that primate or that animal has moved based on just one single find, because maybe we don't find other fossils of the same kind. And then you try to recreate a pattern, a movement pattern for that. I find that fascinating because I always wondered, let's assume they're going to find my foot bone tomorrow somewhere. Do they really get my individual movement pattern from just looking at the bone? Or are there a million options based on the shape of my bone? So how do we know if we choose the right one and select the right one here and try to recreate the evolution, for example? It's still a big question of how did we came about that we walk this planet bipedally in the way we do at all times. From there, you could also argue, if we know how we got there, how can we improve it for patients or simply for the pleasure of running faster or being more efficient or for longer? So I think it is really like the chicken and the egg kind of question. Like if we solve the health problem, we also solve the sports problem and the anthropology question. If we solve the anthropology, we solve the health problem. Like whatever you touch first, it's going to help every other field. And I think for me at least, because I spend so much time with morphology specifically, that is something that I would love to see more of. How is internal, external foot shape linked? Does the internal always mean it dictates the external? How much is dictated by muscles? Can we change that? Obviously, you can train. There is Wolff's law. Like if we do use certain aspects of our body, muscles, bones, they do change also the way they look. Yeah. If we do sports, our bones are denser, and so on. So what can we do to also influence the way we move again? And how does that change our morphology by the way we move? So I think it's super interesting. And I wish that we spend more time with that or more resources maybe, especially because technology is now able to do that. And I'm sure with better, I almost want to say a better atlas in that sense, that if you have more data of the average me and you, where we know how we move, we can then have subgroups of foot types, of certain ages, of gender, of sex, of old, young, anything what we want, and try to find patterns. But that only works if our sample's big enough. And right now, all of those biomechanics studies are tiny. That's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a beginning. It's a beginning.
Yeah, it's a beginning. And that's what we hope for, right? You have to start somewhere. But ideally, these studies one day are big enough to really understand, is that a human trait or is that just an individual doing something? Because that's right now how it looks like. We are very unique in how we move. We are very unique in how we are anatomically built, even though we all have knees. Most of us do. Most of us have feet. We all walk, but we all walk a little bit differently. The bones look a little bit differently. The muscles look a bit differently, the ligaments. I find that extremely fascinating. I wish I could, now I'm going to use the word again, unlock that kind of secret behind it.
Yeah, that's it. Oh, that's great. That means there's a lot to be done, and that's really important. It's funny because we went from, what we say primates, and then, everything, the industrial age, machine and everything. And now we're going back where people want to be active, they want to be moving, and it's good for their health. We're more people on the earth that we've never been before, so we need to walk more to get away a little bit from all those machine and be more active. So yeah, I think if we can get those samples, like you're right, and we're going to get more answers to our question, and we know that answer is going to bring us to have more question again. So, but that's great. That's the evolution, and that's something super, like you said, super interesting to do.
So just for everybody who's listening or watching, Anja and her team made the article open access. So again, Exact name of the article is what, Anja?
Chasing footprints. Chasing. Yeah, I have to admit it's a long title. I actually would have to now look at it again because I usually just call it like chasing footprints of ghosts. That's what I usually go with because that describes the overall feeling of the article
Yeah.
when I went through it. It's a long title, but yeah, on biological reviews, if you go with footprints and ghosts and biomechanist or foot biomechanics, you will definitely find it. It is out there. It's a long read,
And
so
like
make a pot of coffee.
Yeah, and like Frederick said, well, it's a long read, but read it once, read it twice, read it 3 times, and then you'll discover a lot of things that you thought were true that maybe not true anymore, or well, they were never true, but now you know why, and you can treat your patient or do research differently.
And on our part, I can say we're going to keep talking about it for the next few months and even year because I think, like I said, we're just seeing it here in Canada, mentioning it to our students. Even podiatrists have been working for so many years, and like I just did it, in Italy a couple of weeks ago, and with students and podologo, and it was, reaction is instantly they're like eyes open up. All right, this is what's going on, or no, or maybe, and you can see people thinking while you're explaining the article. You just go through it. So it's wonderful work. Once again, thank you. It was really great research.
Thank you so much. It is really, really nice to get that like direct feedback. That is absolutely lovely. And it's great to hear that it kind of encourages people to think outside the box. I think that is what you hope for if they read your article. If they can appreciate also the work that has gone into it. And if someone has more things that I can read about foot mechanisms, I'm always here. I'm happy to read more.
Super.
And write the next paper one day.
Thank you, Anja. It was very nice meeting you and talking to you and sharing your passion too. And we'll talk soon, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Anja. All right. Bye.
Bye.